Amplifier, an undeniable climate emergency podcast.
Today we talk to the wonderful urban environmental sociologist, Hillary Angelo. Hillary is an associate professor at UC Santa Cruz who focuses on urbanization, nature, infrastructure, sustainability, and climate change. We talk about urban planning and how building denser communities can be more impactful than simply greenifying neighborhoods. Why we don't need to destroy intact ecosystems to build out the renewable energy infrastructure we need, and how truly addressing climate change requires changing the broken social relations and structures that caused it. We hope you enjoy this episode.
Hillary, thank you so much for joining us in your recuperation from COVID. We are really grateful and have been really excited to get this conversation going. I think you're just talking about so many of the critical junctures of things that we're facing, looking at potential of making climate transitions in its various ways. So thank you for joining us.
Thanks. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm glad we were able to do this.
First, I think I would just love to hear just if you could talk about your general area of work, and also if you'd like, I'd love to hear how you arrived there. One of the things that I'm hoping as an audience for what we're doing here is to give inspiration to people to get into the sciences and understand how people got there, and maybe if they didn't see themselves in it, see different faces and different people from different places. So if you could maybe talk a little bit about your area of work and how you got there, we'd love to, I'll let you start there.
Sure. That's a great place to start. Yeah, so I'm an urban and environmental sociologist. I'm an associate professor at the University of California, Santa Cruz. I've been a professor for 9 years now. And the way I got into this work is I used to work for the New York City Department of Parks and Recreation. So I usually tell my undergraduate students that I had a job kind of like Leslie Knope, if you know that character from Parks and Rec. Yeah. So I worked for a program that was actually a joint program of the city's Parks Department and a nonprofit. And it existed basically to get citizens involved in city parks and to help city government learn to work better with the public, to sort of, meet the needs of park users better, to create more inclusive spaces and processes for using urban public space. So I worked in that sort of various versions of that position for about 5 or 6 years in my Leslie Knope role. And then at a certain point, felt like I wanted to better understand the problems that I was trying to solve. So a lot of the work I was doing there had to do with things like creating a participatory design process for parks. That was one thing we worked on. Another big issue at the time was what the city called language access, which basically meant better serving new immigrant park users. And a lot of the work that we did there was trying to shift away from an idea that mostly this was about translating signs into other languages and towards much broader conception of kind of inclusion in public space. So in the course of doing that, I was, surveying all over the city. I was working in all kinds of places with all kinds of people. But just to, I guess, repeat what I said before, at a certain point, I felt like I wanted to better understand the problems I was trying to solve. And sociology, as many listeners probably know, is a field that is, basically oriented around this diagnosis and understanding and often transformation of structural society-wide issues, right? So sociologists study groups of people. So it was a good place to go to think about how, political economy, how collective ideas about the environment, and many other things kind of shape our understanding of social life and the way we kind of intervene to improve it. And then I'll just say actually that I didn't go to graduate school thinking that I was going to continue to study environmental topics. But, it was, it's 2008 that I started my PhD, and climate change was on everybody's mind. And the pursuit of urban sustainability became such a, an important focus of urban planning and policy in the last couple decades that's just has remained a major focus of my research.
Fantastic. It reminds me, in New York, because I don't live in Brooklyn now, but I lived in Brooklyn. And in the neighborhood I was in, there was a community garden that really ended up being it was a group of immigrants from Bangladesh who turned it into a major source of food. And this was one of the, I mean, it was actually just very hopeful. And what they did was they brought a lot of techniques from rural Bangladesh. They were mainly women who were working in the garden, and they were doing a two-tiered kind of structure that they built out. And it just strikes me, it's some of that I think was probably done with intention on the park side, but a lot of that was just done by these women saying, we grow our food and there is land that is made available to us. And you see those little moments and you're like, there's seeds there for some much bigger transformation about how we do this, which includes, people coming from around the world and pulling in techniques and abilities to do things, because they produce more food out of that garden than any garden I've ever seen in the city. Yeah. They produce a volume of produce that was really quite remarkable.
Yeah, no, it's exactly those kinds of things. And, so like one park issue at the time was people are planting food in parks. What do we do? Is that a problem? Do we need to remove it? How do we regulate it? Does it need to be regulated? The other big thing that I'll mention, just because it's funny along the lines of the Leslie Knope thing, is that I was part of, at the time, a chicken working group that was dedicated to figuring out. So this is the time when everybody wanted to have chickens in community gardens and in backyards. And so, people trying to figure out, is that legal? How do we do it? And of course, one of the issues there is even what is the chicken for? Is it for eggs? Do we eat it? What do you do when your chicken stops laying? How do you, adjudicate the like hipster vegetarian chicken keepers and the immigrant chicken keepers who often have very different ideas of what the ultimate purpose of a chicken should be. So yeah, exactly those kinds of conflicts.
A lot of chicken and egg problems.
A lot of chicken and egg problems. Yeah, I've moved away from chickens, but that was
Fantastic. Well, so why don't we move on? I'd love to hear your current work, a lot of it in terms of urban greening and climate action plans and transitions inside cities is an outgrowth of that. Maybe you can talk about that work that you've published on and give us kind of an introduction to your thoughts on that.
Yeah. So maybe I'll start by saying I introduced myself initially as an urban and environmental sociologist, and that's true because that's the topics of my research. The other thing I usually say, or I sometimes say, is that I'm a historical sociologist, or what is called an interpretive sociologist, meaning that some sociologists operate much more in the model of the natural sciences, meaning they're doing sort of, experimental designs and they're crunching lots of numbers and that kind of stuff. My work is really informed by history and theory. And so a lot of what I try to do is develop resources that can help us better understand the ways we're acting now, often without thinking about it. Like, what are the common senses that are driving our interventions in cities? So and then from that flows more kind of directly applied and policy oriented work. So I'm going to start by introducing a book that I published a couple of years ago called, in 2021, called How Green Became Good: Urbanized Nature in the Making of Cities and Citizens. It's an academic book. You can tell because there's a colon in the title. But what that book was about and what that project was about was trying to sort of give a historical and sociological account of urban greening. So how do we understand nature, with quotes around those words, and how do those ideas get mobilized when we're making interventions in the built environment? And so that book is a historical study of one industrial region in Germany, the Ruhr Valley, and it looks at sort of successive efforts to green this industrial region from the kind of 1850s through the present. And the goal was, at the time, again, when urban sustainability was becoming and had become such a major focus of policy, to help us see that sustainable cities, which we think of as both sort of apolitical or good for everyone, and also very contemporary and cutting edge, that they're both very old and, very political in terms of who they benefit and what decisions get made and what decisions don't get made. So yeah, so me, I don't know. I could talk a little bit more about some of the arguments in the book, maybe before we, if you want, and then
Yeah,
we can
sure,
shift to some
sure.
of the more applied and contemporary stuff.
Yeah, love to hear.
Okay,
Love to.
so I guess I'd say, and you don't have, you can cut this part, but I haven't. This book came out a couple years ago, so I have to kind of remind myself what I say about it. But the main argument of the book is that there is what academics call a social imaginary of nature. So like a shared understanding of nature as a kind of universal, extra social and aspirational good that has kind of arisen in contemporary urban environments. And this is I'll say, since I know you all are interested in kind of decolonial movements and issues of justice, right? This is a traditionally European and Western idea, right? It's the kind of idea that has produced ideas of wilderness as without people, that has justified the removal of humans from those spaces, right? We see it in all kinds of places. But my argument is that, in urban planning and policy, this idea of nature as this kind of symbolic extra social good is what makes it possible to green cities. So to kind of like apply these signifiers of nature to urban environments. So planting trees, building parks, and that is one mode that we humans, and we particularly like Western, European humans, have recurrently used to make cities, quote, better over the last 150 years. And that we see those same old tropes getting replayed in contemporary efforts of, urban sustainability efforts. And yeah, I'll stop there. So it like the kinds of projects that I had in mind when I was writing this were things like the ubiquitous tree planting initiatives, and right, sustainable cities that are sort of green and walkable cities.
Right. So, and that's, yeah, and this whole idea of pristine nature as unpopulated by humans, which of course is an utter fiction. I mean, the Americas were fully managed and interacted with humans, and those ecosystems had been shaped by the humans, but it was much more convenient to create parkland that was supposed to be pristine by erasing those people.
Exactly. Yeah. And I think, there's been so much more, I think there's so much more public discussion of that now than there was even 10 years ago. That is, it's great. And I love that when I talk to students now, they know that, they know that wilderness is a fiction. But nevertheless, like, I do think it's really interesting how those ideas have kind of remain, if not undisturbed, more or less intact in a lot of planning initiatives. So I can just give some examples. I was saying before, like tree planting initiatives are a big one. They're happening all over the world in the name of climate change. There are a lot of problems with those initiatives. There was actually one. It was called the Million Trees Initiative, was going on in New York City when I worked there. So just like one struggle that I remember there was that the trees often died, right? So the contractors who planted the trees we couldn't enforce. I think in the contract they were supposed to water them, but that wasn't enforceable. So the trees often died. And so you had to marshal, armies of volunteers to go out and water the trees. And there were just tremendous amount of tree loss. And of course, that happens today with current tree planting initiatives, as well as all kinds of other things that there's now media coverage of, like, is it doing any good? What else is the land being used for?
Right.
Who's planting the trees?
And out of urban circumstances, it's often, that it ends up getting turned into tree plantations for harvest. And, and I think, it feels like there's related but different issues in terms of non-urban and urban areas when it comes to things like tree planting. But it seems like one of the commonality weaknesses is that trees don't exist as separate things. They're part of ecosystems, and trees don't really store carbon and clean the air. It's ecosystems that do. And I think that that's a lot of what I find so fascinating about the area of work that you're in, which is we tend to not think of urban areas as ecosystems, right? That's cities are human things, and then ecosystems are outside. But in fact, cities are a form of ecosystem even when they haven't been greened, right? There's all kinds of different life. And it's how do we understand that ecosystem? How do we actually design an ecosystem that makes room for nature and however you want to call it, that makes room for growth, that can store carbon, that can lower temperatures, that can deal with all these other things. But how do we understand even cities as ecosystems?
Yeah, no, that's a really important point. And I think, I guess it's worth saying that my work builds on work by other people who make that argument explicitly. Like cities, there's nothing unnatural about New York City or any other city, and there's nothing pristine about the stuff outside of cities usually. And yeah, so again, I guess like this is more, just sort of big picture who I am, but as a sociologist, so my intervention is to sort of like say like, okay, and what's the social like wash on that? When we take the city as an ecosystem and then we have a bunch of us running around in it, what are the decisions that we make that shape that in various ways? The other thing, I'll just say that the book highlights a lot is how this imaginary of nature, this idea of nature as good and extra social, makes it possible for us to sort of green in the name of the public good, right? To genuinely believe that we're serving everyone and everyone the same way and like making the right social and ecological decision by adding a tree or adding parks. And often, and because these are desirable, right? Because people actually do want parks and open spaces and trees, that often forecloses discussion. It makes it harder to have discussions about these projects in the first place, and to have a discussion about like, well, what about a park as opposed to something else? We all want a park, but would we prefer to have a school? Or, is the park the thing that's really going to reduce the carbon footprint of the city as much as affordable housing or investments in public transit?
Right.
Yeah. So we sort of start with this narrow lens, and it's really hard to kind of break out of that.
Well, and Bloomberg's New York City is probably just the best poster child for the idea of a sustainable city that really was about turning the city into a playground for the rich and not about serving the majority of the population at all, right?
Yeah, absolutely. New York is one.
I mean, there were benefits that did accrue to everyone. I mean, when you do some of the bike lanes are just a net good, right? There are things that are net good, but the thinking behind it was definitely not about equity at all, right? That was just didn't, and I don't think it just didn't really enter into the DNA or the architecture of what they were doing.
Yeah, and San Francisco is another. I mean, many of the sort of affluent post-industrial cities that we uphold as paragons of sustainable urbanism today are, as everyone knows now, very unequal and unaffordable. And so, again, I have colleagues doing work that sort of look at that, right? Like you can have sustainability in one place, right? You can have a dense walkable city, but if you have everybody commuting long distances to get there, if all the people who live in that city are buying new iPhones every year, the carbon footprint of that consumption and the services that make their urban lives possible is huge once you expand beyond the city boundaries.
So what are some of the do you think are some of the kind of foundational ideas that can move towards a more equitable and actually impactful when it comes to long-term sustainability? What are some of the principles that you think are really have been missing historically?
So I'm going to start with the sort of softest and squishiest, most amorphous one, just because I mentioned it earlier. I think, the first one is just trying to pop the bubble of nature as the knee-jerk, unexamined good, right? Like, so that doesn't mean anything in terms of specific policy proposals, but that when somebody says, I have a great idea, let's plant 1 million trees, it's probably good to take a step back and have a conversation about, what is actually the best way to solve the problems that we're trying to solve.
Right.
So then more concretely, the things that, and this gets into some of the more kind of applied and policy oriented work that I've done since then. I guess there's probably 2 to 3 principles that I would name. So first is that we look to sort of gray as well as green interventions when thinking about sustainability. So again, a policy-oriented paper that I published on California's climate action planning is called "Missing the Housing for the Trees." So it's a study.
That's a great title. Really, that's a great title.
My co-author, Adam Millard-Ball, who is a planner at UCLA, came up with the title. So he deserves total credit for that. But I also love the title. And so the point, we analyzed California cities' climate action plans, particularly their sort of operationalization of equity goals. Like what were the policies that they put in those plans saying this is how we're going to do something good for equity. And so mostly we found that they missed the housing for the trees, meaning that they focused on green sustainability interventions, things like parks and trees, rather than things like gray infrastructure and other kinds of things, such as mostly, affordable housing, public transit, sometimes jobs, that kind of stuff, that even though it doesn't look like nature or doesn't, signal sustainability in quite the same way, are the things that are going to have sort of greater impacts on both equity and things like carbon emissions.
I mean, just density of the zoning changes to allow density of housing is one of the, I mean, that's one of the, seems like one of the key battlegrounds, because that's where you face such massive resistance from existing stakeholders who think, well, I mean, exactly, that's the housing and the trees. We're like, no, we want an open, undense, green neighborhood. Well, that's not actually what the future can look like, right? We need denser housing. We need more people together in urban areas. And then we need to think through what that looks like, right? We need to think through. So it's not just piling more housing, because that's, if you look at the public housing model that we had in the 50s and 60s, which was disastrous. So it's not about concentrating, but this really seems to be one of the key areas, which is how do we think, instead of green, how do we think about a positive density, right? A density that actually serves the populations.
Yeah, no, I think that's exactly right. And then, I mean, and of course, just density itself also isn't enough, right? Like if you build a ton of market rate housing, that can end up being exclusive, in different ways. So I think, I think yes, and continuing to talk about what that should look like. And maybe, this could move us to principle number 2, which is another point that I try to communicate in my work, and that others in my field do too. This isn't just me saying this, but that we need to focus on both sort of areas of urban concentration as well as the sort of broader landscapes that those cities rely on. So, I'm now going to quote another published paper that's about sustainability in one place by Mostner and Miller. And so I think they're looking at the city of Freiburg, and there's a sort of, again, a kind of dense, walkable, green enclave that looks like a perfect example of the kind of density that we want. But when, again, you think about some of the things that we've been talking about, where are people commuting from, who's living there, where are the goods coming from, and what are the footprints of those, you can say, okay, we have a teeny little sustainable circle, but as soon as we expand our view, we see all the unsustainabilities that is premised on. And I think, that's a way of thinking about some of these equity concerns. I mean, it's a way of thinking about what does that density need to look like, and how does that density need to be connected to broader infrastructure, transportation, and, economic networks that make sustainable, low carbon living possible for a lot of people, and that makes these broader landscapes, more sustainable in a holistic way. And I keep using this word sustainable as a shorthand for, again, like low carbon, climate friendly, relatively just, but obviously there's many, the word itself is, fraught and vague. So I'm aware of that as I'm saying it, but
do you think that there are there exemplars that you think are hopeful in terms of where some of this work is being done?
Yeah, that's such a good question, and I should have a much better answer. I'll say first that, so my current research, which maybe we'll talk a bit more at the end about, is motivated by exactly that question. So I went looking for people who are doing things differently, who are doing a really good job, who are kind of like pursuing transitions, who are transitioning to new energy infrastructures, new relations to land, new ways of living in late modernity, in ways that are not reproducing some of the problems of the past. A lot of that has taken me outside of city centers, so which is why I'm going to struggle a bit. But, I would say I'll just use an example that's closest to home for me, because it's, I guess, the one that comes to mind first. So I live in Santa Cruz, California, which is a small city. It's 50,000 people. And it's kind of squeezed between the Monterey Bay and the Santa Cruz Mountains. And it's an old hippie surfing town that has become a kind of second home destination for Silicon Valley bazillionaires. So it's very expensive to live here, and there's not enough housing, and it's very hard to expand because there's the ocean and the mountains on both sides. So,
and the zillionaires who don't want to change any zoning, they just want to keep what they got.
Right.
I would imagine.
Yeah. And so there's a big discussion about densifying in this place, like where it's mostly single family homes. What that looks like are the addition of accessory dwelling units, so ADUs, these little like granny units in people's backyards that could be rentals. We also have the University of California, Santa Cruz here, which means you have a lot of students whose parents help them pay their rent, and if you get 10 students together whose parents are helping them pay their rent, that can be a lot of money for a homeowner who has a rental property. You could be charging $10,000 a month to the 10 students or 5 students. So I think, I guess it's not an example of things that are working super well, but it is an example of a place. I think it's also useful to look outside of the big cities, right? So San Francisco and New York are they're the places that I know really well and a lot of us study, but the struggles relate to struggles that are happening all over the US and the world, but I think it's also important to look at smaller places. Anyway, moral of the story. So I think Santa Cruz, has problems that are extreme, and there are a lot of people here working really hard to try to do it better. And so, I don't know that we're succeeding, but I'll just say that our climate action planning team is trying to think in holistic terms about equity and justice considerations in some of the ways that I talked about. I have colleagues here who are doing a lot of research on kind of unsustainabilities in the periphery. So they're looking at the wildland urban interface. Basically, okay, so what's happening for people who can't live in the city or in the town? They're getting pushed into the mountains because that's where there's cheaper rental properties. Those areas are also increasingly fire prone. We had a big fire here a couple of years ago. A lot of those places burned. Most of those renters don't have insurance. Many of those houses are not up to code, all that kind of stuff. So I think doing that research is part of my first principle of just expanding the conversation and helping us begin with a more holistic understanding of what it means to tackle these problems, rather than thinking we can, slap a tree or a park on it and, that will help us get there.
Right. And really looking holistically at the sustainability part, like lowering carbon emissions and other emissions, because, I always think of climate change as kind of the sharp end of the stick, but we're dealing with so many civilization collapsing calamities simultaneously in terms of biodiversity, in terms of microplastics, in terms of soil, in terms of water, in terms of everything, that that if we don't resolve global warming, everything falls apart. But if we only look at that, we're also failing. And then looking at those questions of equity. So how are we flattening? How are we raising living standards and flattening while doing that?
Yeah.
Sorry, I see you.
No, sorry to interrupt. Yes, I'm just not, I'll say to the listeners, I'm nodding vigorously. Yeah. And I think what you just said makes me want to say even more explicitly what I just said. So I didn't give you a very good answer to what's a good model, but I think, I think people, and so people who've made arguments for a Green New Deal in recent years, I think, I think sort of left social movements that are seeing that addressing climate change means addressing social relations, right? It means changing the structures of society. That is the way to, to save the world. That is the way to address climate change.
Right.
And therefore, the pursuit of urban sustainability too would involve all of those things, meaning that trees don't come first, but that all these questions of social relations and social structures.
I mean, how I kind of have come to think of it is that social relations are changing and will change because of climate change and ecological collapse and all these interrelated things. The question is, do we steer that change, or are we just kind of haplessly thrown about by the waves of it? And the window to intentionally make those changes to, I mean, first of all, a world with billionaires, just, I mean, we see that the super rich, it's about a million times more, the richest have like a million times more carbon emissions than an average person. I mean, it's just incompatible with life on Earth, right? So there's all of these things that as you say, like starting to look at the social relations and changing towards questions of equity is not just a moral right, it's a survival basis. And I mean, I would also put into that questions of native and indigenous sovereignty and land back. And again, it's quite practical. 5% of the world population is indigenous, shepherds 80% of the biodiversity. Native struggles in North America have kept there'd be 25% more carbon emissions without like resistance to pipelines. So these things are really a matter of the questions of equity and justice, to me, now become much more centered in a concrete sense that if we don't tackle those, we will not tackle the tsunami of crises that we're facing.
Yeah, no, I think that's exactly right. I agree completely. I was talking to someone actually just this morning who said, he said, of course I support diversity, equity, inclusion, and Jedi things. But the point, what we really want are people, organizations, institutions, governments to be thinking about those issues, not because we feel bad or it's politically important, but because it's also going to produce better outcomes. I mean, it is the route to, all of those things.
And meanwhile, the billionaires are stealing and lying to indigenous Hawaiian folks like Zuckerberg and building $500 million bunkers as their solution. I mean, that's not, I saw Bill Gates coming out and saying we should just accept 2 degrees of warming and us tech bros will solve it. I mean, that it's seeming more and more obvious the paucity of actual solutions coming from existing institutions and the wealthy, and the absolute need to start resolving these questions if we're going to make it through to the other side as a civilization, really. So, I mean, how do you look at the Green New Deal as a structure? Do you think it's moving in the right direction? I think that there's gaps in everything, and it's clearly already on one level it's radical compared to what it is. On the other, it's very much built around the realm of the possible. Mm-hmm. I don't know if you have critiques of it or thoughts on that, or ways that you would adjust our thinking towards those kinds of large scale social policies for transition.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, so I'm a former city government bureaucrat and current professor who works for a large state institution, the University of California. So you can probably guess from that I'm a person who sort of believes in working within existing structures. And so, I think the Green New Deal obviously in that, like sustainability, that means different things and it can be kind of a buzzword. It comes in many different iterations and all that stuff. But, I think it's been a really important kind of way to plant a left flag and say, here's a vision, here's a progressive vision in the realm of the possible that can inspire policy and inspire us again to ask the right questions, like to help us retrain our vision from these kind of narrow and very technocratic versions of addressing climate crisis to a much more holistic one that very explicitly makes the link between social and environmental justice goals. So I think that's super important and good. Yep. For me, I mean, my own, I guess, approach to this stuff as an urban environmental sociologist who's focused on history and theory, a thing that really interests me is how do we do it? Like, how do we get from A to B? You were talking about, not just sort of letting transitions happen and trying to guide the directions that these transitions will take. And so we live in a world that is, of course, quite constrained in many ways by prior decisions, right? We live in a world of legal structures, of institutional structures, of epistemological or, like cognitive cultural structures, like the ideas of nature we were talking about before. The physical landscape is shaped by those ways, right? We have cities in particular places, and we have roads in particular places, and we don't have public transit in other places, all those kinds of things. So I think my own personal interest in this is like, how good can we get, short of a revolution, short of the end of capitalism, short of putting all the bazillionaires on a rocket ship to Mars. What is the work that needs to be done, and who are the people that are doing the work to kind of take existing structures and infrastructures and institutions and kind of, bend them towards justice and sustainability in the broadest sense, to like move them. Yeah.
When I think, to me, one of the critical things is, it's unclear to me whether capitalism makes it on its own, whether anybody tries to overthrow it, whether it just kind of collapses. All this work changes the precursors that you were talking about that we're having now. If whatever comes 50, 100 years from now, if we haven't made a transition away from fossil fuels, we're screwed. And if we manage that transition now, in however incomplete it might be compared to our ideal, it places all future development in a much stronger position. And if we've built in food infrastructure that's resilient, and we've figured out how to reduce the heat island effect in cities, and we've figured out how to create housing that generates more electricity than it takes in, and all of these things, every successful step we take toward that kind of transition just puts us in a better place, however we're able to steer in the future. So, I mean, these things just seem so vital, and the window we're in now, every change we make now has an outsized impact on a historic and really a geologic level. I mean, we're at a really, all the scary charts are there to underline what we do now is going to change the very, nature of the global ecosystem, right? And it will impact and determine whether we're leaving an infrastructure that allows for even better ideas and better transitions, or whether we foreshorten that, right? Foreshorten that potential.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. And maybe, I mean, I don't know if it's too soon, but we could transition to some of the work I was going to say. This
feels like a really good transition, because a lot of that then those are real sites of all the things you were talking about. What is it we're actually trying to accomplish? And so much of that seems to be getting overlooked. And so I would love to transition, and maybe you can just start by telling us about this, about the use of public lands and land use in general, and what that means for a energy transition and an environmental transition.
Yeah. So I'll just say, working on public lands now, with the kinds of questions in mind that we've been asking, like who are the people trying to do things differently within current structures to the extent possible. Specifically, I've been looking at renewable energy development, mostly in the Nevada desert, conservation and co-stewardship initiatives, mostly in southern Utah. So that has to do with, involvement of tribes and indigenous groups, and housing development around cities in both areas. So mostly Las Vegas and St. George. But so what are we thinking about kind of urban form, urban growth, relationship between cities and hinterlands, and affordable housing? But let's start with energy, because I think, because I've published a piece on it that everyone should read, which came out in Harper's Magazine in January 2023. Mm-hmm. And I'd love you to share it with your listeners. But I've done the most work.
It was a great piece, and we will absolutely link to it and push it.
Fantastic. And it's, I don't know if it's legal, but I'd be happy to provide a PDF if anyone wants to read it, if they don't subscribe. But I've done the most work on the energy stuff, and I think it relates most directly to some of what you were just saying about, like, a couple of points that I'd want to unpack a little more. So one of them is, I think one challenge is that we need to act now. Like, as you were saying, we need to decarbonize the energy system. We need to do it now. And in some ways, right, the path of least resistance for doing that, given the urgency, is to continue doing things the way we've been doing them, because those are the established systems and procedures. And of course, the problem with that is that in so doing, we then reproduce all the problems of those systems. And so, for example, in the case of renewable energy, so I've been doing work in the Nevada desert, mostly in my county, which the county itself, I can't remember the numbers off the top of my head, but it's absolutely huge. It could, if it was covered in solar panels, it could power the entire planet. It's the size of some small northeastern states, maybe Rhode Island and something else combined. It is huge. And it's 90-something% public land, quote unquote public land. So, the Biden administration and utilities and energy developers, in the interest of getting renewable energy projects built fast, and in the interest of bringing, affordable carbon-free energy to urban renters and people who don't have rooftops or own their homes, has been to build utility-scale, large-scale solar projects in the deserts of Nevada and elsewhere, also oceans and those kinds of things. But, in so doing, what you end up also doing is kind of creating new energy corridors or industrializing parts of the desert and causing a lot of problems for habitat and biodiversity, which of course abuts another issue that you were raising, which is the extinction and biodiversity crisis. It's hard to talk about this without getting things like super technical, and I am not the technical expert. But, basically people agree we're going to need some large scale solar. And it's relatively more affordable and expedient to build on these kind of undisturbed lands. There are, of course, though, as you probably know, and listeners know, other places available to do renewable energy development, such as along highways, such as on brownfields, such as old agricultural land, such as private parcels, all kinds of things. But it requires more and different kinds of work, right? It's different sorts of effort, different sorts of structures, a different political economy of energy development to make those kinds of things happen. So, and then meanwhile, you end up with the people who in Nevada who are protesting these sites getting called kind of climate deniers when really they're just trying to, not always, but frequently are trying to make an effort, an argument of that sort to say like, hey, we're doing it again. We're repeating these old patterns. We're sacrificing more tortoise habitat. Why don't we try other things instead, like less growth, less consumption, or different choices about land use? So I think I wanted to say that just to kind of put a little more concretely some of these issues on the table and how the kind of the urgency of decarbonization, I think, again, makes it really hard to kind of, none of us are really able to say, okay, great, we're starting with a blank slate. We have all the time in the world. How are we going to build an energy system for the 21st century?
Right. And then, there was a concept that I really love. And I think I first, I'm trying to remember where I first read about it, but the idea of an efficiency power plant, which is that rather than building a new power plant, that if you actually go and energy efficiency is actually extremely low hanging fruit that we just still are leaving hanging on the tree, that you can build an efficiency power plant, i.e. you reduce the demand so you don't need the new power plant. And that like that kind of thinking, which is, again, if we look at it holistically, which is, it is so much more efficient if you could reduce that amount of energy than to build a massive solar, even if you're using, I think what you call disturbed land, right? Like brownfields or other areas that have already been disrupted as ecosystems. But still, if you could just reduce that demand for the energy, it accomplishes the same thing in terms of carbon emissions, actually even more, because there's baked in carbon into building the renewable. And this isn't the same. We do need to build these energy systems, but we need to think of the whole picture And so it's really interesting, because then now you're really kind of laying out, it's where is the, first of all, what energy is actually needed, where could we be reducing demand in often ways where the efficiency aren't about lowering living standards. They're just about like throwing away waste. I mean, there was a recent thing just about how much, I'm trying to remember the numbers, but if our car sizes had remained the same, how much less air pollution there would be. And that was not about need. And I can say certainly in my area where there's a lot of pristine, not a fleck of mud, massive pickup trucks with one person driving around with or without the Trump flags. That was nothing about raising up quality of living. It was about driving more profitable lines for auto companies. So there's no one's interest, as well as making the roads more dangerous. So that's one of those kind of places where we're looking at that there's so much that we could do, not about lowering living standards and making people eat bugs or whatever the right is terrified or trying to gin up terror about, but about just taking this utter waste that we're still just not even touching, then looking at how is it that we implement it in ways that don't disrupt ecosystems unnecessarily. And also you look at, of course, all the questions of native sovereignty, where once again, Thacker Pass, where they're trying to force a lithium mine. We are going to need a lithium mine, but who gets to decide where it's mined and who benefits from the mining? Right now, it's the same structures, the same people are supposed to sacrifice, and the same people are supposed to profit to basically just change one input into the same system, right? So I think it's, anyways, yeah.
Yeah. No. I'm, again, just nodding vigorously in agreement. Yeah. I mean, in terms of your first point you were making, I think it's, not lowering living standards. And in many cases, raising living standards. And this is, again, I think where the Green New Deal has done a really good job articulating the relationship between social and environmental justice goals. So if you're talking about, insulating the homes of rental, insulating rental properties, making improvements to homes that need it, making sure they have, functioning heat and air systems, like that kind of stuff does reduce energy use. So that should be a part of it. Yeah. And I think then, and then this gets, you invited me to get on a soapbox at some point. So, I will say, like, then in terms of the land use planning stuff, it's really fascinating. And this is where I just become a former Parks Department nerd who's really interested in land use planning questions. But land use planning structures, so the institutions that end up having to make decisions about where to put energy, a lot of that's the Bureau of Land Management, which is an incredibly underfunded, kind of archaic and really just struggling public agency. Trump moved the headquarters to Colorado. There were a lot of retirements. So they have a difficult mandate. Their mission hasn't changed exactly in a long time. They're working under extreme duress, and it's to my mind, like somewhat absurd that they have become the kind of de facto arbiter of these decision makings. So we should, of course, better fund the Bureau of Land Management. We might also consider things like a federal land use planning agency, which we have had at prior moments of American history. But also things, the other thing that happens is that we end up privatizing conservation, right? So you end up with this thing where utility companies build, or, solar developers build where they want, mostly on public lands. The federal government incentivizes that because it makes it possible to meet renewable energy goals faster. And then you have foundations or just philanthropists, buying up private parcels to save wilderness or, intact habitat in other places. I think it would be, I would love to see large environmental groups, like the Nature Conservancy or others, doing the work, the legal and financial work to make these other kinds of lands more viable. So the problem with, sometimes the problem with brownfields or mountaintop renewal sites or agricultural sites is that they're too small or they're far from transmission lines. Often the problem is that the parcels are smaller and somebody needs to put them together. So, for example, there's currently a debate about where to put some new transmission lines in Nevada. And the place that's been proposed is Highway 50, the loneliest road in America. It goes straight through the Great Basin Desert, which is one of just, important habitat, big unspoiled spaces, one of the last places in the lower 48 where you have that kind of just that kind of land. And there have been arguments by people who work in this state and who are professionals in this area that instead we should try to do that energy corridor along Highway 80, which is already a developed, industrialized, highly disturbed place. The problem there along Highway 80, and this gets back to, history and the legacies of prior decisions, is that that's all checkerboard land, which is something I had never heard of until I started doing work in the West. But so it's the legacy of like the railroads, and the federal government sort of did this checkerboarding thing where you had public and private parcels, side by side. And so you can't build a transmission line now on those checkerboarded parcels because you'd have to put all those properties together. You have to buy all the land, or you have to get everybody to agree. Anyway, those are the kinds of things that make it hard to build in better places. And so I want to see nonprofits and policymakers and planners directing their efforts towards those kinds of interventions, which, I think help us decarbonize our energy system, help us deal slightly better with biodiversity and extinction crises, and, build new, again, like sort of institutional and bureaucratic structures that facilitate better land use planning moving forward. So
great. Well, maybe we will take up we are not a large nonprofit that can do that, but we can shout at it about it.
Yeah.
With and for you, because that does, because I mean, and I do think that's so critical to be like looking at those things which are really concrete and solvable, but it's even getting people to be thinking of them as part of the landscape of what we're dealing with, right? And especially, and I think this is a lot of what you've been talking about, is especially we're an urbanized world. We're going to only become more urbanized as we go, and it's very easy for people to simply ignore all the systems that support those areas. So a lot of this stuff is just invisible. So people, and we all hear it now, someone saying, well, I've got an electric car, as if, great, but they're not thinking about Thacker Pass and land that has been despoiled and stolen once more going in, and the attempt to just over the heads of the people whose land it is to put in more destructive mining in ways that won't necessarily benefit there, in order to provide the battery for their car. Or a third of the microplastics in the ocean are coming from tires, and that's going to be, and an EV car future isn't going to resolve that. So how do we start getting people inside the cities to both be thinking about equity inside the cities and real solutions, but also seeing themselves as part of a system, right? Seeing themselves as, where is the energy coming from? Where's the food coming from? How is that getting produced? And you can feel it, I think now probably more people are aware that their beef may be causing deforestation in the Amazon, right? That these systems are also not necessarily proximate. Mm-hmm. They may be very far flung. You can start to feel it's starting to come through, but that feels like at the heart of the work you're doing, and what makes it so vital is really getting people to understand where they exist, where they and where the attempts to make transformation exist within these broader energy, food, and labor, all the different systems and inequities that are built in. Because if we don't solve it on the level, we haven't solved it, right? We are making pretty downtowns for wealthy people to stroll through and feel green, and actually hurtling towards disaster at just the same pace that we were prior.
Yeah, no, yeah, I think that's right. And yeah, I this work that I'm doing now, which will be a book, it's some years down the line, but I think the goal of that is, I've been saying, to create a national conversation about public lands, partly because they're interesting and people don't know that, it's a quarter of the land in the U.S., or at least 1 in 10 acres of land in the United States is managed by the Bureau of Land Management. It's a huge amount of, territory of this continent. And I think, everybody has a stake in decisions that are being made on them. But yeah, I think you're right about helping us see ourselves as situated in these broader networks, which are domestic and international. Yeah.
Great. I mean, this is, I'm aware I was the one telling you needed to rest. So I don't want to wear you out too much. But I'd say, are there other areas that you feel like we've missed or that you'd like to dive in deeper to? Because I could sit and talk with you all day long, but trying to be respectful, so I'll let you. But I'd love to hear if there's areas that you'd love to dive into.
Yeah. Well, I'll just say this is a fun conversation. I guess we all do a lot of podcasts these days, but I appreciate this one more than many. I just appreciate your attention and engagement with these issues. Well, the last thing I would want to talk about is maybe the question of the role of indigenous groups and tribes and what does that mean? So, because I you've mentioned it a couple of times, and I was became connected with you all because of meeting Sam at the Bears Ears Summer Gathering, where he was there doing some other work, film work. And yeah, I guess I just want to talk about how that appears in my work. Yeah. So the work that I've been doing, not related to energy, is related to kind of conservation and co-stewardship efforts in southern Utah. So as you probably know, the Bears Ears National Monument, which was created by Obama and reduced by Trump and reinstated by Biden, has been a kind of historic model of co-stewardship, meaning the U.S. federal government is working as a peer sovereign nation with an intertribal coalition that formed around Bears Ears that was central to advocating for the formation of the monument and is now part of its management. And so that's, there's obviously a lot of movements right now to think differently about land ownership and stewardship in this country, land back being, one part of it, code stewardship being a more kind of reformist attempt to restore sovereignty and decision-making power to people who had that stripped from them. And I think, again, as we were saying earlier, like that's important, not just for sort of political reasons of inclusion, but because it leads to better outcomes. And so one of the other things that I'm looking at in this work and that I'm interested to kind of see is what's happening to environmental organizations and to understandings of kind of conservation work in this country that throughout the 20th century were led by, white organizations informed by these European ideas of wilderness and whatnot. And so how are they changing their epistemology, their kind of understandings of, concepts, that the nature that they're working with and on in response to these movements? So in what ways are we doing things differently in those terms? Are we understanding the land itself differently, making different decisions about its management, and actually creating structures that make it possible for those different approaches to become part of federal land management in this country? So, yeah, I don't know.
Right. And that's, and then there's, obviously we could spend weeks diving into that, but I think there's so many fascinating things around, for instance, traditional native-led controlled burns, which were criminalized and people could go to jail. And now you're starting to see the federal government actually bring in Native folks to train, because our land management was, again, it was that the whole idea of the pristine wilderness was that you shouldn't touch it. And it was never pristine. It was never untouched because there were humans here. There was lots of them. There was many cultures and nations, and they had a relationship with fire and forest that was managing it in a way that was much more effective, and that's becoming more critical as global warming is drying and pushing these things. And that's just one example of so many of those. And that's what I think. For me, I probably do consider myself a revolutionary on a fundamental level, but that's more to me just like practically that I don't think the current system will get us there. But every step we take to bring back sovereignty, to bring in equity, to address these problems, to me, being a revolution isn't that one day we're going to, turn it all on its head. It's all part of a process, and we know that history changes and nothing lasts forever, and all of these efforts are critical, right? And so to me, there's not really an either or. It's like, what works? What is the smallest local policy that actually impacts people's quality of living, that actually lowers our carbon emissions, that actually improves the water, that improves the air, that improves the nutrition, that improves all of these things? Every single one that we can learn, from the smallest neighborhood effort to international treaties, if they're working, they're all, it's all about kind of pushing and learning, and how do we generalize and do it. That's really, I would say, for Undeniable in this podcast, that's kind of our core thing. What can we amplify? What can we learn and try and be part of pushing it into the process of how people are thinking of these things? And I do think that questions of sovereignty and land back are one of the central questions. One of the central questions that has been left out historically, and only just, we were talking to Melinda Adams just last week about controlled burn. She was saying, really, we're talking about 12 years since it started to become something that was even permissible. Yeah. Right? 12 years. It's so recent that these conversations have started to open up. But I think that that's one of the central ones that I think needs to be in the middle of it. Because, to me, I probably would have seeded the problem as capitalism earlier in my kind of political thinking. Now I really just see, it really is, we're at the end stages of colonialism. Like, all of this came from that kind of extractive, where other human bodies were considered just tools and fuel, and land was there to be extracted from in order to generate it. And everything has kind of flowed from that. And capitalism is one piece of that process. And that we're just, now needing to, how do we filter that deeper understanding, including sovereignty and land back, into all of the thinking of what we do?
Yeah. Yeah. I think, they are related and significant and deeply shaping of our current world. And I guess, again, as a former bureaucrat and current social scientist, I agree with you, like, burn it all down, give it all back, like that, I fully support those kinds of political projects. And at the same time, what I've been trying to identify in a similar way to as we were just discussing with energy is, okay, so what does it actually take? Like, what does it mean to decolonize conservation? And so how are these environmental organizations changing their board composition? How are they changing the work they're doing? How is the Bureau of Land Management changing its planning processes, right? To move from a sort of consultation, a kind of often sort of symbolic consultation, to actually sharing power in a substantial way. What is it like? There's, again, and I'm just now going to describe work that other people are doing that I'm lucky enough to get to witness, but like, people who are trying to think about conservation beyond the boundaries of various national monuments and parks that have been established that have no relationship to the ecological or cultural landscapes as a whole. On the Colorado Plateau, a lot of groups are doing that kind of work. So
and power, and I think you hit the key word, which is power, is not what faces do you see, not what are things named, but who has actual power and decision making and the ability to steer these kinds of projects. And I think that is the key word. That it's really about relinquishing, and that relinquishing power and shifting where that power is. And I think that's kind of a keystone or North Star or something. One of those things that really needs to be at the middle of all the work that we're doing about who really is controlling what happens, who really has the ability to say no or yes or how, and what are the outcomes of that. So I think that's really critical.
No, I think that's right. And the, back to our urban constituents and energy consumers and stuff. I think part of the, I think urban social movements, climate justice movements, young people in the country today, have done a really good job in many ways, becoming aware of these issues and fighting pipelines. And there's been obviously a lot of interest in Thacker Pass and the lithium mine that you mentioned earlier. But I think also finding a way, I don't know. Yeah. Back to the creating a national conversation, creating some attention to these issues, raising awareness about some of the more like mundane, prosaic work that's being done to try to steer the ship, and support those efforts is what I try to do, and what I think is also important.
Well, thank you so much for your time. This is really just fascinating and critical, and I certainly hope not the last time that we talk about this. We would love to check in with you, and this work is just going to become more and more vital. And I think that the kind of thinking and the frameworks that you're introducing, likewise, this kind of thinking is going to be so critical. So I hope we have a chance to talk lots in the future.
Me too. Thanks so much. Thank you for the work that you guys are doing there.